prairie stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted in gold and lavender, the setting sun bleeding its colors across the horizon. The land was quiet, save for the low whistle of wind threading through tall grass and the occasional call of a lark diving toward its nest. Out here, miles from the nearest town, life moved slow, measured by the rise of the sun and the creak of saddle leather, rather than the clamor of clocks or the noise of streets. Alara had grown used to the silence. At 25, she had lived most of her life in the same weather-worn farmhouse, where the wooden boards sighed with every step, where the air smelled of cedar and bread, where loneliness sat heavy as dust on the windowsills. Her parents had passed when she was young, leaving her the land, the house, and a hollow ache that no amount of chores could fill. She rose with the dawn, milked the cows, mended fences, cooked her meals alone, and went to bed listening to the night animals sing. She had read of love in books, grand, tales of first kisses beneath starlight, of warm embraces by roaring fires, but such things felt as distant to her as the moon. Men came and went through town, ranch hands and traders, but none ever looked her way with more than polite curiosity. She had learned to bury the longing, to live quietly, her heart a secret she told no one. That was before the storm brought him to her door. It had rolled in sudden and wild one afternoon, thunder chasing the sky until it split open in sheets of silver rain. She had just finished securing the animals in the barn when the knock came, loud, urgent, echoing against the roar of the storm. She opened the door to find a tall man framed in lightning, his coat drenched, hat pulled low, water dripping from the brim. His eyes, though, were the first thing she noticed, gray as storm clouds themselves, sharp but carrying a tired kind of gentleness. "Ma'am," he said, voice deep and steady, "my horse threw a shoe out on the ridge. I'd be obliged if I could wait out the storm under your roof." She hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping aside. "Of course, come in." He thanked her with a tip of his hat and crossed the threshold, the warmth of his presence filling the room in a way the fire never had. He introduced himself simply as Luke, a cowboy drifting through the territory in search of work. And though she nodded politely, something in her chest stirred, a spark she hadn't felt in all her years alone. As the storm raged on outside, they sat by the fire, speaking in quiet tones. He told her of cattle drives that stretched for weeks across barren plains, of nights spent under the stars with nothing but coffee and the lowing of steers, to keep him company. She told him little of herself, embarrassed by how small her life sounded in comparison. Yet he listened as though her every word mattered. His gaze never strayed, steady and intent, as if he could see past the walls she had built, past the silence that cloaked her heart. When she faltered, unsure, he smiled, a slow, warm smile that made her insides twist. She caught herself staring at his hands, strong and calloused, and wondered, for the first time in her life, what it might feel like if those hands touched her not out of necessity, but out of tenderness. The thought startled her. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, cheeks burning, praying he hadn't noticed the flush. But Luke noticed everything. When the lightning lit the sky and thunder rattled the panes, he leaned just a little closer, his voice soft enough that it nearly disappeared beneath the storm. "You've been alone a long while, haven't you?" She froze, the truth of it too heavy to deny, too raw to admit. She managed only a nod. His eyes softened, though his voice carried an edge of sorrow. "That ain't how a heart's meant to live." She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it impossible to reply. For in that moment she knew, without ever having spoken it, that he saw her. Not just the chores she did, not just the land she held, but the ache she carried like a second skin. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe she didn't have to carry it alone. The storm stretched on into the night, rain pounding so fiercely against the windows that the glass trembled as if in fear, thunder rolling like drums across the plains. Alara had banked the fire higher, and the living room flickered with warm, restless light, painting both her and Luke in shades of golden shadow. She sat curled on the edge of the couch, the quilt still drawn around her shoulders, her heart drumming harder than the storm itself, while Luke leaned in the armchair across from her, long legs stretched toward the hearth, his hat tipped low now, his eyes half hidden but never drifting from her face. Conversation had slipped into silences, not the kind born of discomfort but of something heavier, something alive in the air between them, as though every word spoken only pulled them closer to what neither dared to name. She found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. The strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled damp at the ends from the rain, the the scar just visible above, his collar that made her wonder about the stories carved into his skin. Each detail felt dangerous. Stirring thoughts she had never allowed herself to entertain. She had lived 25 years without a single kiss. 25 years believing romance was something reserved for others. Not for the girl who spent her nights sewing torn sleeves by lantern light and her mornings hauling buckets of water from the well. But now, in the presence of this cowboy whose voice seemed to settle straight into her bones, she felt that belief begin to crumble. Luke broke the quiet at last, his tone low and steady. "You ever get tired of the silence out here?" She startled, meeting his gaze across the fire, heat rushing to her cheeks as if he had plucked the thought right out of her chest. "Sometimes," she admitted softly, "but it's the only life I've known." He leaned forward, forearms braced on his knees, the fire catching in his eyes. "Silence can keep you alive, but it can also starve you." The truth of it cut through her, sharp and undeniable, and she dropped her gaze to her hands, twisting the edge of the quilt between her fingers. For a long moment she said nothing. But then, against her better judgment, the words slipped free. "I wouldn't even know what I'm missing." Luke tilted his head, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Wouldn't you?" She shook her head, almost ashamed of the confession. "I've never been kissed. Not once, not by anyone." The admission seemed to hang in the air, louder than the thunder, heavier than the storm. Her chest burned as though she had just given away the most fragile secret she possessed, and she wished she could take it back. But Luke didn't laugh, didn't flinch. Instead, he stood, slow and deliberate, and crossed the space between them. The air shifted, thick and electric, as he stopped before her, looking down with a gentleness that startled her more than his strength ever could. He crouched, so his face was level with hers, the firelight gilding his features, and spoke in a voice roughened with something tender. "That ain't right. A woman like you deserves more than silence and empty years. Let me fix that, and show you real love." Her breath caught, the quilt slipping from her shoulders as her body went rigid, torn between terror and desire. The storm roared against the walls, but inside the world held still, as if the land itself leaned in to watch whether she would lean toward him or away. The fire had burned low, glowing embers painting the room in a deep, molten red, the shadows longer, the silence sharper. But Alara could barely hear the storm outside anymore. All she could hear was her own heartbeat, thrumming in her ears, and the cowboy's voice, low and steady, still hanging in the air. "Let me fix that, and show you real love." She sat frozen, quilt puddled at her feet, his words circling inside her like a river current threatening to pull her under. Luke hadn't moved after saying them. He crouched there before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, close enough that his warmth wrapped around her as surely as the firelight. Every part of her screamed to retreat, to run back into the safe shell of silence she had built for years. But another part, wilder, truer, ached to know what it would feel like to finally be touched, to finally be seen. Her lips parted, breath shaky, and before she could find the courage to answer, Luke lifted a hand, slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to stop him. His fingers brushed her cheek, rough calluses trailing like sparks across her skin, and her eyes fluttered closed against the overwhelming tenderness of it. No one had ever touched her like that. Not with hunger, not with pity, but with reverence, as if she were something precious. His thumb lingered at the corner of her mouth, and when she inhaled sharply, he leaned closer, his breath mingling with hers. "Say no and I'll stop," he murmured, his voice a vow. But she didn't. She couldn't. The silence she had lived in for 25 years broke with the smallest whisper, "Please." That was all it took. His lips met hers, warm and firm, stealing the air from her lungs, igniting something fierce and unyielding inside her chest. It wasn't the clumsy fumbling she had always feared her first. Kiss might be. It was steady, certain, like he had been waiting his whole life to teach her this single truth. Her hands, trembling at first, rose to his shoulders, clinging to him as though he were the only solid thing in the world. And when he deepened the kiss, slow and unhurried, she felt years of loneliness shatter in the space between heartbeats. When at last he pulled back, his forehead resting gently against hers, she realized she was crying, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable relief of being wanted, of being held. Luke's thumb brushed away her tears, his voice rough but certain. "That's just the start, darling. Real love ain't in grand gestures or sweet words. It's in nights like this, when the storm rages and you've got someone who won't let you face it alone. She laughed shakily, a sound torn between disbelief and wonder. And in that moment she knew her life would never again be the same. The woman who had never been kissed had just been shown what it meant not only to be kissed, but to be loved. From silence to a kiss that changed everything. Alara's story reminds us that love finds us when we least expect it. And sometimes it takes a cowboy to teach us what our hearts have been missing. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe, because more tales of love, loss, and life under the wide open sky are coming your way.